The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of traffic courtroom 304. Dr. Maya Richardson stood in line, checking her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. She was already running late for an important meeting at the university, where her research team was waiting to discuss their latest findings in neuroscience. The traffic court was busy that Monday morning. People from all walks of life filled the wooden benches, their faces showing varying degrees of worry and frustration. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, barely keeping the summer heat at bay. Maya's professional black blazer and pencil skirt felt uncomfortably warm, but she maintained her composure, just as she always did. "Next case," called out the court clerk, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Maya stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had presented research to rooms full of acclaimed scientists, yet there was a slight tension in her shoulders. The red light violation ticket in her hand seemed ridiculous. She was certain the light had been yellow when she crossed the intersection. Judge William Whitman sat behind his elevated desk, his gray hair and black robe giving him an air of authority that seemed to weigh heavy on everyone who approached. He didn't look up as Maya walked to the podium, instead shuffling through the papers before him with an expression of mild annoyance. "Name?" he asked, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had asked the same question hundreds of times before. "Dr. Maya Richardson," she replied clearly, emphasizing her title slightly. It was a habit she had developed over years of being underestimated and overlooked. The judge finally glanced up, his pale blue eyes scanning her briefly before returning to his papers. "Miss Richardson," he said, deliberately ignoring her title, "you're here for a red light violation on Oak Street and Fifth Avenue, is that correct?" Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the kind that came with being dismissed, with having her achievements casually brushed aside. "Yes, Your Honor, but I'd like to explain the circumstances. I have evidence that the traffic camera may have malfunctioned." She reached into her leather briefcase, pulling out printed screenshots from her dashboard camera. Her hands were steady, though her heart rate had picked up slightly. As a scientist, she believed in evidence, in facts, in the power of clear demonstration. "The timestamp on these images shows the light was yellow when I entered the intersection," Maya continued, her voice professional and measured. "I also have data showing that this particular intersection has had multiple complaints about its camera system." Judge Whitman barely glanced at the evidence she tried to present. He leaned back in his chair, a slight frown creasing his forehead. "Miss Richardson, are you suggesting that our traffic systems are faulty?" The dismissive tone in his voice was unmistakable. Maya noticed how several heads in the courtroom turned toward her, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. She stood straighter, drawing from the same well of patience she used when explaining complex neurological concepts to first-year medical students. "Your Honor, I'm simply presenting evidence for your consideration. As someone who works with data analysis daily in my role as head of the neuroscience department at—" "Miss Richardson," the judge interrupted, his voice sharp. "This is a simple traffic violation. The fine is $300. Do you need time to arrange payment?" The assumption in his question was clear. He didn't believe she could pay the fine immediately. Maya felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment but from controlled anger. She had faced similar assumptions throughout her career, from her early days as a research assistant to her current position as a respected scientist and upcoming TED speaker. "I can pay the fine now, Your Honor," she replied coolly, reaching for her wallet. The upcoming TED talk about racial bias in medical treatment suddenly felt even more relevant. She would pay this fine, but this interaction would not be forgotten. Little did Judge Whitman know that this brief encounter would soon come back to challenge everything he thought he knew about making snap judgments. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Next case," he called out, already looking past her to the next person in line. But this was far from the end of their story. It was just the beginning. 1 year had passed since the traffic court incident that changed everything. Dr. Maya Richardson stood at the podium in the largest courtroom of the state Supreme Court building. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, and court officials from across the country. "When I walked into traffic court that day," Maya began, "I was just another person fighting a ticket. Today, I stand before you to share the amazing changes that have happened since then." In the front row, Judge Whitman sat with his daughter Emma, who had just passed her bar exam. Next to them was Maya's daughter Zara, now a high school senior planning to study law in college. The two families have become close friends over the past year. Our bias training program has been adopted by 43 states, Maya continued, showing slides of statistics on the large screen behind her. Traffic court complaints about unfair treatment have dropped by 60%. But numbers don't tell the whole story. She clicked to the next slide, showing a collection of photos. There was Judge Whitman speaking at law schools, Maya giving workshops at police academies, the two of them together at community meetings. Each image told a story of change. But our proudest achievement, she said, smiling at Judge Whitman, is the Justice Fairness Initiative. The screen showed a new building on the university campus, the Center for Judicial Equality and Reform. It was a joint project between the courts and the university, dedicated to studying and eliminating bias in the justice system. Judge Whitman stood up to join her at the podium. He looked different now, more humble, more approachable. A year ago, he said, I was part of the problem. Today, I'm working to be part of the solution. Every morning, I look at that traffic court video to remind myself why this work matters. From the audience, Attorney Torres raised her hand. Can you tell us about the mentoring program? Maya's face lit up. This was her favorite part. We now have 50 judges mentoring minority law students. Judge Whitman himself has mentored 15 students, including my daughter Zara's debate team. These students are our future judges and lawyers, and they're learning about fairness from the start. The presentation continued with more stories of change. A judge from Texas shared how he had completely reformed his courtroom procedures. A law professor from Michigan explained how she used their story to teach ethics. A court clerk from Florida described new systems for tracking and preventing biased decisions. After the presentation, Maya and Judge Whitman walked through the courthouse hallways together. They stopped at a new display case. Inside was the original traffic ticket, Judge Whitman's social media post, and a photo from the TED talk. The plaque read, "Where change began, a story of recognition, responsibility, and reform." Did you ever imagine, Judge Whitman asked, that a traffic ticket would lead to all this? Maya shook her head, smiling. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest moments. We just have to be brave enough to face them. They walked outside, where news cameras waited to interview them about their latest project, a nationwide campaign called Justice Sees No Color. But before facing the cameras, they took a moment to watch some young law students entering the courthouse. Look at them, Maya said softly. They'll never know what it was like before, when people were judged by their appearance before they could speak. They're walking into a different kind of courthouse. Judge Whitman nodded, and that's the real victory. Not the programs or the laws, but the change in people's hearts and minds. As they prepared to face the cameras, Maya thought about all the people who had told her their stories over the past year. People who had faced bias but now had hope for change. People who had admitted their own biases and worked to overcome them. Ready? Judge Whitman asked, straightening his tie. Ready, Maya replied. Let's keep changing the world, one courtroom at a time. They walked toward the cameras together, no longer a judge and a defendant, but partners in a movement that had grown far beyond them. Their story had become a symbol of hope, proving that even the smallest moment of injustice could lead to the biggest changes, if people were brave enough to admit their mistakes and work together for something better. The next morning, Dr. Maya Richardson sat in her office, preparing for her TED talk rehearsal. Her phone buzzed with a message from the court administration office. They wanted her to attend a meeting about her complaint. Today, in 1 hour. Sarah, please reschedule my rehearsal, Maya called to her assistant. And get me the contact information for Janet Torres, the civil rights attorney who helped with our medical bias research last year. Across town, Judge Whitman paced in his chambers. The formal complaint sat on his desk, each word seeming to accuse him. He had spent a sleepless night watching more of Dr. Richardson's talks and reading her research papers. The more he learned, the worse he felt about his behavior. At exactly 10 a.m., they both arrived at the courthouse administration building. Maya walked in confidently, wearing a deep purple suit that she had planned to wear for her TED talk. Behind her came Attorney Torres, carrying a thick folder of documents. The meeting room was small but bright, with a long table in the middle. Court Administrator Mrs. Chen sat at the head of the table, her expression neutral. Judge Whitman sat on one side, looking less commanding without his black robe. His face showed signs of a sleepless night. Dr. Richardson, Mrs. Chen began, emphasizing the title, "Please share your concerns about yesterday's proceedings." Maya opened her laptop and pulled up a video. "I have here the courthouse security footage from yesterday morning." She pressed play, and everyone watched the interaction unfold on the screen. The dismissive tone, the interrupted explanations, the assumptions about payment, it all looked even worse on video. "Your Honor," Maya said, turning to face Judge Whitman directly, "I wonder if you would have treated a white male doctor the same way. Would you have dismissed his evidence without looking at it? Would you have assumed he needed time to pay a $300 fine?" The room fell silent. Judge Whitman's face reddened, but he didn't look away. "Dr. Richardson," he began, his voice different from yesterday, softer, more respectful. "I spent last night watching your TED talks about bias in professional settings. The irony is not lost on me." "This isn't about irony, Your Honor," Attorney Torres cut in. "This is about a pattern of behavior that affects countless individuals in our justice system. Dr. Richardson happens to be in a position to challenge it, but many others are not." Maya pulled up another document on her laptop. "I've analyzed the last 6 months of your traffic court rulings, Judge Whitman. The data shows a disturbing pattern in how fines are assigned and how evidence is considered based on the defendant's race and gender." Judge Whitman stared at the statistics on the screen. The numbers didn't lie. His rulings showed clear bias patterns he had never noticed before. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "What do you want from this meeting?" he asked quietly. Maya leaned forward. "I want systemic change, Your Honor. I want mandatory bias training for all court officials. I want a review system for traffic court proceedings. And I want you to sit in the audience at my TED talk tomorrow." Mrs. Chen raised her eyebrows. Attorney Torres smiled. Judge Whitman looked surprised. "Your talk?" he asked. "You want me there?" "Yes," Maya replied firmly. "Because tomorrow I'm not just talking about bias in medicine anymore. I'm adding a new section about bias in our justice system, and I want you to hear it firsthand." The tension in the room shifted. This wasn't just about a complaint anymore. It was about an opportunity for real change. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat. "Judge Whitman, what's your response to these requests?" The judge looked at the statistics again, then at Dr. Richardson. In her face, he saw not just anger or accusation, but a determination to create meaningful change. He remembered her words from the TED talk he'd watched. "Recognizing our biases is just the first step. The real challenge is having the courage to do something about them." He straightened in his chair, making his decision. What he said next would either make this situation much worse or become the start of something important. The whole room waited for his response. Judge Whitman took a deep breath before speaking. The meeting room remained silent, waiting for his response. "Dr. Richardson, I accept all of your requests," he said firmly. "And I would like to add one more thing. I want to make a public apology before your TED talk tomorrow." Maya hadn't expected this. She exchanged glances with Attorney Torres, who gave a slight nod. "That's unexpected, Your Honor," Maya said carefully. "Why?" "Because this isn't just about me attending a talk or implementing new training," he replied. "It's about acknowledging my mistakes publicly so others can learn from them." He pulled out his phone and opened his social media. "In fact, I've already started doing something about it." He turned the screen toward them. On his official judge's social media account, he had posted a long message just an hour ago. Maya leaned forward to read it. "As a judge, I have always believed in justice and fairness. Yesterday, I failed to live up to these principles. I treated an accomplished professional with disrespect and bias in my courtroom. Dr. Maya Richardson, a renowned neuroscientist and TED speaker, came before me for a traffic violation. I dismissed her evidence without review and made assumptions based solely on her appearance. I was wrong. After learning about her work in studying bias and discrimination, I realized I had become a perfect example of the very problems she fights against. Tomorrow, I will attend her TED talk not as a judge, but as a student ready to learn and change. I invite my fellow legal professionals to join me." The post already had hundreds of shares and comments. Local news stations were picking up the story. Mrs. Chen was reading something on her tablet with raised eyebrows. The local news wants to cover this, she said, looking up. They're calling it The Judge and the Scientist, a story of bias and change. Your social media post has gone viral, Judge Whitman. Maya sat back in her chair, processing this turn of events. This was bigger than she had expected. Her phone buzzed. The TED Talk organizers were calling again. "Excuse me," she said, stepping out to take the call. In the hallway, the organizer's excited voice came through the speaker. "Dr. Richardson, this is perfect timing. We want to live stream tomorrow's talk. The story is exploding on social media. People are already calling it a powerful example of confronting bias in real time." When Maya returned to the meeting room, she found Judge Whitman and Attorney Torres discussing plans for the new bias training program. Mrs. Chen was already drafting a formal announcement about changes in the traffic court procedures. "There's one more thing," Maya said, getting everyone's attention. "The TED organization wants to livestream tomorrow's talk. They think this story could help spark similar conversations in other cities." Judge Whitman nodded slowly. "When I posted that message, I knew I was taking a risk. My colleague judges might not approve. Some people will say I'm just trying to save face. But watching your previous talks made me realize something. Change doesn't happen without discomfort." Speaking of discomfort, Attorney Torres interjected, checking her phone. "The story has reached the state Supreme Court. They're following the situation with interest." She looked up at Judge Whitman. "Your courage in admitting your mistakes publicly might influence more than just local courts." Maya looked at her watch. She had just 4 hours until her scheduled rehearsal. Her original talk needed major revisions now, but sometimes the best speeches came from real, raw experiences. "I need to go prepare for tomorrow," she said, standing up. "Judge Whitman, I'll see you at the auditorium at 9 a.m. sharp." As she gathered her things, Mrs. Chen spoke up. "Dr. Richardson, I think what's happening here is extraordinary. You turned a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for systemic change." Maya paused at the door. "The real test starts tomorrow," she said. "This isn't just about one judge or one courtroom anymore. This is about showing people how to acknowledge their biases and actually do something about them." She walked out, her mind already planning tomorrow's talk. Behind her, a movement had begun, starting from a simple traffic ticket and growing into something that could change many lives. The evening before the TED talk, Dr. Maya Richardson sat in her home office, surrounded by notes and empty coffee cups. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. The story had spread far beyond their city, and now national news outlets were trying to contact her. "Mom, you should see this." Her teenage daughter Zara called from the living room. Maya walked out to find Zara pointing at the TV. A national news channel was showing Judge Whitman's social media post with the headline, "Judge's honest admission about racial bias goes viral." Maya sat down beside her daughter, watching as legal experts on TV discussed the importance of acknowledging bias in the justice system. Some praised Judge Whitman's bravery, while others questioned if his apology was enough. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Zara asked, looking at her mother with concern. Maya smiled, touching her daughter's hand. "Actually, I'm more determined than ever. This isn't just about me and Judge Whitman anymore. This is about all the people who face unfair treatment every day but don't have a platform to speak up." Across town, Judge Whitman was having a very different evening. He sat in his study, reading through hundreds of comments on his social media post. Some of his fellow judges had called, some supportive, others critical. His daughter Emma, a law student, sat with him. "Dad, look at this," Emma said, showing him her phone. It was a message from one of her law professors. "Your father's honesty about his bias is going to be part of our ethics curriculum next semester. This is how real change happens." Judge Whitman rubbed his tired eyes. "I keep thinking about all the cases I've handled over the years," he said quietly. "How many times did I let my biases affect my decisions without even realizing it?" "But you're doing something about it now," Emma replied. "That's what matters." Meanwhile, at the TED Talk venue, preparations were in full swing. The technical team worked late into the night, setting up extra equipment for the live stream. Sarah, Maya's assistant, coordinated with security about handling the larger-than-expected crowd. We're getting registration requests from judges and lawyers across the state, Sarah told the event organizer. They want to hear both Dr. Richardson and Judge Whitman speak. Back at home, Maya finished rewriting her speech. The original talk about bias in medicine had transformed into something bigger, a real-life story about confronting prejudice and creating change. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Attorney Torres. Just got word, the state Supreme Court Chief Justice will be watching the live stream tomorrow. Your story is starting conversations at the highest levels of our justice system. Maya took a deep breath. She walked to her bedroom and opened her closet, looking at the outfit she had chosen for tomorrow. A powerful red dress, bold, confident, unapologetic. As she touched the fabric, she remembered all the times she had to prove herself, all the assumptions she had faced. Her phone buzzed one more time. It was a message from Judge Whitman. Dr. Richardson, I've been practicing what I want to say tomorrow. I hope my words can help others recognize their own biases as I have recognized mine. She replied simply, See you tomorrow, Your Honor. Together, we'll show people that change is possible. That night, as the city slept, two very different people prepared for a day that could change many lives. In her bedroom, Maya Richardson finally put down her notes and tried to sleep, thinking about all the people who would be watching tomorrow. In his house, Judge Whitman sat awake, practicing his speech over and over, determined to make his words count. The next morning would bring cameras, crowds, and national attention, but more importantly, it would bring an opportunity to turn a moment of bias into a movement for change. As Maya finally drifted off to sleep, she smiled, knowing that sometimes the most powerful stories come from the most unexpected places, even a simple traffic court hearing. The morning of the TED talk arrived with bright sunshine and clear skies. By 8 a.m., a line had already formed outside the auditorium. News vans parked along the street, reporters setting up their cameras and microphones. Inside her dressing room, Dr. Maya Richardson stood before the mirror, adjusting her red dress. Sarah rushed in with updates. The auditorium is full. We've set up overflow rooms with screens. There are judges, lawyers, and civil rights activists from all over the state. Maya nodded, feeling surprisingly calm. She had given many talks before, but this one was different. This wasn't just about sharing research, it was about showing real change in action. At exactly 8:45 a.m., there was a knock on her door. Judge Whitman stood there, looking different in a business suit instead of his court robes. His face showed a mix of nervousness and determination. Dr. Richardson, he said, I wanted to check if you're okay with what I'm planning to say in my introduction. Maya gestured for him to come in. For a moment, they sat together, no longer judge and defendant, but two people trying to make a difference. They reviewed his speech, made a few changes, and agreed on the timing. At 9 a.m. sharp, the TED talk began. The red circle on the stage seemed to glow under the spotlights. The event organizer welcomed the packed audience and the thousands watching online. Today's talk is unique, she announced. Before Dr. Richardson speaks, we have a special introduction from Judge William Whitman. The audience murmured as Judge Whitman walked onto the stage. He looked out at the sea of faces, took a deep breath, and began speaking. 3 days ago, I made a mistake in my courtroom. I let my biases affect how I treated an accomplished professional. I dismissed her evidence without looking at it. I ignored her title. I made assumptions about her ability to pay a fine. I did everything that, as a judge, I should never do. The room was completely silent. Cameras flashed. In the front row, Emma, the judge's daughter, wiped tears from her eyes. But today, he continued, I'm not here to just apologize. I'm here to show that when we confront our biases openly, we create an opportunity for real change. Dr. Richardson could have simply filed a complaint and moved on. Instead, she chose to turn this incident into a teaching moment, not just for me, but for our entire justice system. He turned toward the side of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Maya Richardson. The audience erupted in applause as Maya walked onto the stage. She shook Judge Whitman's hand as he stepped aside, both of them aware of the powerful image they were creating. Maya took her position in the center of the red circle. The room fell silent again. Thousands of people waited for her words, both in the room and watching online. 3 days ago, she began, her voice strong and clear, I walked into a courtroom expecting justice. What I found instead was a perfect example of the biases I've spent my career studying. But today, I'm not here to talk about that moment of bias. I'm here to talk about what happened next. She clicked her remote, and behind her, a large screen showed the courthouse security footage. This video shows bias in action, but what you're about to hear is a story of how we can transform bias into breakthrough, prejudice into progress. In the audience, Judge Whitman sat straight, ready to hear her words not as a judge, but as a student. Next to him, Attorney Torres smiled, knowing this moment would be remembered in legal education for years to come. Maya looked out at the audience, her red dress bright under the lights. What I learned this week is that change doesn't always come from grand gestures or policy changes. Sometimes, it starts with a traffic ticket, a moment of bias, and the courage to admit when we're wrong. The audience leaned forward, captivated. Maya Richardson was no longer just a neuroscientist or a TED speaker. She had become a symbol of how to turn discrimination into dialogue, confrontation into conversation, and she was just getting started. 1 month after the TED talk, Dr. Maya Richardson's life had changed in ways she never expected. Her speech had gone viral, reaching over 10 million views online. But the real change was happening in courtrooms across the country. She sat in her university office, reading emails from people who had watched her talk. There were messages from judges, lawyers, and ordinary citizens, all sharing their own stories of bias and transformation. Dr. Richardson, Sarah called from the doorway. Judge Whitman is here for your meeting. The judge walked in, carrying a thick folder. The past month, they had been working together on something important. A new training program for the state's judicial system. You won't believe what happened this morning, Judge Whitman said, sitting down. 3 more states have asked to adopt our bias training program, and the state Supreme Court wants us to present it at their annual conference next month. Maya smiled, remembering how different things had been just weeks ago. How are things in your courtroom? She asked. Different, he replied, his face thoughtful. We installed cameras that record all proceedings. Every decision is reviewed for bias, and you should see the changes in how other judges handle their cases. They're more careful, more aware. He opened his folder and pulled out a newspaper. The headline read, Traffic Court Revolution, How One Incident Changed the System. Below was a photo of Maya and Judge Whitman speaking to a group of law students. But the best part, he continued, is what happened yesterday. A young black woman came to my court for a parking ticket. She was a medical student, and she had evidence that the parking meter was broken. Last month, I might have dismissed her evidence without looking. But yesterday I listened. I reviewed her photos. And you know what? She was right. Maya nodded, understanding the significance. It wasn't just about one case or one judge. It was about changing how the system worked, one decision at a time. Her phone buzzed with a message from Attorney Torres. Turn on Channel 5 now. Maya grabbed the remote and turned on her office TV. The news showed a press conference at the state capitol. The governor was signing a new law, the Judicial Fairness and Accountability Act. The law required bias training for all court officials and established a review system for court decisions. This law, the governor was saying, was inspired by the courage of 2 people who showed us that acknowledging our biases is the first step to eliminating them. Judge Whitman watched the screen, shaking his head in amazement. When I wrote that social media post admitting my mistake, I never imagined it would lead to this. Maya's daughter Zara burst into the office, excited. Mom, my social studies teacher showed your TED talk in class today. We had a whole discussion about bias and justice. Even the kids who never talk in class shared their stories. This was perhaps the most important impact, reaching young people, helping them understand bias before it became deeply rooted. Maya hugged her daughter, proud that their story was making a difference in classrooms too. Later that afternoon, Maya stood in front of her mirror at home, getting ready for another presentation. This time, she and Judge Whitman were speaking at a national conference about transforming the justice system. She touched the frame of a new photo on her wall. It showed her and Judge Whitman on the TED talk stage, shaking hands. Below it was a framed traffic ticket, the one that had started it all. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from a judge in another state. Your story gave me the courage to examine my own biases. Today, I apologized to someone I had treated unfairly in my court. It's not easy to admit our mistakes, but it's necessary for real change. Maya smiled, knowing that their story had become more than just a viral moment or a popular talk. It had become a movement, spreading from courtroom to courtroom, classroom to classroom, changing hearts and minds one conversation at a time. 1 year had passed since the traffic court incident that changed everything. Dr. Maya Richardson stood at the podium in the largest courtroom of the state Supreme Court building. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, and court officials from across the country. When I walked into traffic court that day, Maya began, I was just another person fighting a ticket. Today, I stand before you to share the amazing changes that have happened since then. In the front row, Judge Whitman sat with his daughter Emma, who just passed her bar exam. Next to them was Maya's daughter Zara, now a high school senior planning to study law in college. The two families had become close friends over the past year. Our bias training program has been adopted by 43 states. Maya continued, showing slides of statistics on the large screen behind her. Traffic court complaints about unfair treatment have dropped by 60%, but numbers don't tell the whole story. She clicked to the next slide, showing the collection of photos. There was Judge Whitman speaking at law schools, Maya giving workshops at police academies, the two of them together at community meetings. Each image told a story of change. But our proudest achievement, she said, smiling at Judge Whitman, is the Justice Fairness Initiative. The screen showed a new building on the university campus, the Center for Judicial Equality and Reform. It was a joint project between the courts and the university, dedicated to studying and eliminating bias in the justice system. Judge Whitman stood up to join her at the podium. He looked different now, more humble, more approachable. A year ago, he said, I was part of the problem. Today, I'm working to be part of the solution. Every morning, I look at that traffic court video to remind myself why this work matters. From the audience, Attorney Torres raised her hand. Can you tell us about the mentoring program? Maya's face lit up. This was her favorite part. We now have 50 judges mentoring minority law students. Judge Whitman himself has mentored 15 students, including my daughter Zara's debate team. These students are our future judges and lawyers, and they're learning about fairness from the start. The presentation continued with more stories of change. A judge from Texas shared how he had completely reformed his courtroom procedures. A law professor from Michigan explained how she used their story to teach ethics. A court clerk from Florida described new systems for tracking and preventing biased decisions. After the presentation, Maya and Judge Whitman walked through the courthouse hallways together. They stopped at a new display case. Inside was the original traffic ticket, Judge Whitman's social media post, and a photo from the TED talk. The plaque read, Where Change Began, a story of recognition, responsibility, and reform. Did you ever imagine, Judge Whitman asked, that a traffic ticket would lead to all this? Maya shook her head, smiling. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest moments. We just have to be brave enough to face them. They walked outside, where news cameras waited to interview them about their latest project, a nationwide campaign called Justice Sees No Color. But before facing the cameras, they took a moment to watch some young law students entering the courthouse. Look at them, Maya said softly. They'll never know what it was like before, when people were judged by their appearance before they could speak. They're walking into a different kind of courthouse. Judge Whitman nodded, and that's the real victory. Not the programs or the laws, but the change in people's hearts and minds. As they prepared to face the cameras, Maya thought about all the people who had told her their stories over the past year. People who had faced bias but now had hope for change. People who had admitted their own biases and worked to overcome them. Ready? Judge Whitman asked, straightening his tie. Ready, Maya replied. Let's keep changing the world, one courtroom at a time. They walked toward the cameras together, no longer a judge and a defendant, but partners in a movement that had grown far beyond them. Their story had become a symbol of hope, proving that even the smallest moment of injustice could lead to the biggest changes, if people were brave enough to admit their mistakes and work together for something better.